Mr. Norton. We've got a new video here on European exploration. In this one, we're going to focus for the most part on what the motivations were, some of the technology that was created or borrowed in order to make European exploration possible, and then we're going to finish off with basically what happens as far as the Spanish and their invasion of Mexico and Southern America. We won't completely finish that off. There are some other aspects that we'll talk about in a future video and future lecture. Some of the things you need to take note of during this time is that Europe is making a transition. They're moving from an agrarian-based economy. If you're not familiar with what agrarian means, it just simply means we're farming. And we're going to be transitioning into more of one that's based on industrialism. We also have a change in where the center of trade occurs. The new center of trade will occur along the Atlantic seaboard, more specifically along Western Africa, Western Europe. But that's going to be part of the reason because of triangular trade that occurs. Okay. So let's talk about some things that are going on as well. We have some motivations too on what are the main motivations for European exploration. There's three that we signal out, and they're referred to as God, Glory, and Gold. So some of the things that you want to make sure that you're aware of is that up until the point where we begin European exploration, Europeans don't have a whole lot of interaction with people outside of Europe. You did have some attempts, before we get to the Renaissance, where Europeans tried to basically retake the Holy Land through the Crusades. That would be Jerusalem, which was obviously unsuccessful. But for the most part, you don't have a lot of interaction. You don't have any interaction with the Western Hemisphere because Europeans don't even know that that exists yet. So one of the things, I'm going to focus more on the economic motives. We're going to kind of go with the gold theme here. Is the main reason that we can point to European exploration basically being pursued is the fact that all the trade that you used to get from Asia through overland trade routes basically gets shut down. The Ottoman Empire basically takes that and shuts it down. So it's not that you can't get goods from Asia. You have to basically pay a middleman for it. So you had Arab merchants, Arab traders, who would then trade things from Asia to the people in Europe. But because you can't get it from anyone but those traders, they basically took those prices and made them outrageous. So not being willing to continue paying those outrageous prices for them, they're looking for a way to get into Asia. Okay. Now, there are some other motivations too. There are these stories of fantastic lands that are out there, and so some people want to go ahead and seek out these mythical lands. One of them happens to be like this allegedly powerful Christian kingdom that's out there. And then there's another one that's referenced in your textbook about giants with jeweled eyes. The thing that I always find funny is that basically all these stories are written by someone who clearly has never seen them, and yet he's running around saying, oh, these things exist. It's like the earliest thing that we can cover as far as fake news is concerned. But we also have God as a motivation too. We have some kingdoms that we've already been familiar with that are really motivated by religion. Spain being one of them and Portugal being another. They find it to be their goal to go ahead and spread the word of Jesus Christ and basically try and save the world from basically going to hell. Okay, because you got to know Jesus in order to make it to heaven. So that's one of their goals. But of the three that were in there, gold is going to be the one that plays the biggest role. So how does expansion actually occur? Well, some of the things that happen is because monarchies become more centralized. So because of that, things we covered in a previous lesson, where they start to gain the ability to have more money through taxation, is they're able to basically pour money into these adventures. So the funding is actually coming from national governments. Now, there are some things that come about too that are very helpful. One of the things we want to make sure we're aware of is that maps kind of are pretty bad at this time. The only map that they end up using ends up being Ptolemy's map, and of course there's problems with it, like he only accounts for 3 continents, and he only accounts for 2 oceans. The one thing that really is shocking is when I first started reading stuff and learning about this is that, remember the whole idea that, oh, everybody thinks the world is flat, which there's still people who are flat earthers today. So They didn't actually think that back then. They were aware that the Earth was round. The problem is that they drastically underestimated how big it was. So that was one of the reasons why Columbus, who we'll talk about later, thought it would be easy to just sail west and hit Asia. So some things that are helpful as far as technology is we have not the invention, but they borrowed the axial rudder and lateen sails, which we can see pictures here. Basically, that allows you to sail against the wind and makes you more seaworthy. Ships are also being made where they're large enough to mount cannons on it, so we'll see how that actually works in the advantage of Portugal when they eventually take over the trade routes and spice trade into Asia. Some other things were invented too, like the compass and astrolabe. I may have just butchered that last one in terms of pronunciation, but those help with navigation. Some knowledge as far as wind patterns help too, so that you can find ways to sail with the wind rather than trying to fight against it. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the role of Portugal, and the main person we're going to focus on here is Prince Henry the Navigator, who was behind much of the European expansion. So Portugal has some of those motivations we talked about earlier. It's not so much glory, but it's God and gold. So they're looking for trading partners that they can basically enrich their kingdom with, and they're also looking to spread the word of Jesus. So they're looking for Christian allies too, because one of the issues that the Iberian Peninsula is dealing with, if you're not familiar with that term, that's Spain and Portugal, is that they've had problems with Muslim invaders for many years. And in one of our previous lessons, we talked about how Ferdinand and Isabella had been able to basically drive Muslims out of their territory. Basically, remember, you were either going to convert to Christianity or you were going to be thrown out. Okay, so Portugal ends up trading with African nations. So some of the things that they trade directly in is they trade in slaves and they trade in gold. What ends up happening is they basically start creeping down the coast of Africa till they hit the south. And so once they hit the southern coast, they start setting up military forts. So how do they do that? They basically not purchase, they lease land from African nations, and they go ahead and build these stone fortresses that can basically oversee trade or any ships in the area. And so that's going to be one of the ways that they dominate in terms of sea trade. So Portugal does get to India. So the first person that ends up, because I said the Portuguese are basically making this creeping, every year they get a little closer to Asia as far as they're setting up. You got to keep in mind too, is like you just have a straight shot sail to India. You were going to have to stop and resupply, and that's basically what Portugal was doing during this whole time, is setting up ways for them to make stops along the way. But the first person to make it there is Vasco da Gama. And so when he gets there, he ends up loading up on all of these goods that they're looking to trade. And so even though when he gets back he loses some of his ships, the profit was so incredible, it was several thousand%. So once you get news that, hey, did you hear what this guy did? He made this profit of several thousand%. Well, of course, that's going to start drawing the attention of other European nations. And what we're going to eventually see, and of course in later lessons, is that Portugal is not going to be able to maintain their grip on the trade, on the spice trade in the East. Okay. Now, some of the reasons why Portugal isn't able to hold on to that are going to be, if you are familiar with Portugal's size, it is extremely tiny. They are incredibly dwarfed by Spain. So because of that, they don't have the manpower, they don't have the money to actually hold on to those things. So eventually they get replaced by the Dutch, and then we'll eventually get to the point where the Dutch are replaced by the English. Okay. Spain basically goes a different route. Spain tries to go west. And if you're familiar with Christopher Columbus was hired by the Spanish king and queen, Ferdinand and Isabella. Columbus himself is Italian. So basically what happens is Columbus sails west, and he lands in the Caribbean. And again, this goes back to where they think the earth is much smaller than it is. So he lands there, finds the people in the Caribbean, and he calls them Indies. It's also why it's referred to as the West Indies. Now, when he reports back to the king and queen, he has two messages that are obviously going to be very welcoming to the Spanish crown. Oh, I can find plenty of gold here, and there's a great opportunity to spread the word of Jesus Christ. So that's going to be one of the things that, again, feed into trying to colonize and take over the Western lands. One of the other things I want to make sure we're familiar with too is that as far as South America goes, there's going to be a treaty that is negotiated between Portugal and Spain called the Treaty of Tordesillas. I may have butchered that. I don't think I did though. And the thing is the person who was in the middle of negotiating that was actually the Pope. If we go back to one of our lessons on Spain, the Spanish monarchy was in really good relation as far as being friends with the Pope. And so, as it turns out, that treaty, the only thing that Portugal even gets out of South America is Brazil, and the rest is essentially left off to Spain to try and conquer and rule. Okay, so who's going to really be responsible for all of the conquering of South America? Those are going to be the conquistadors. And conquistadors, even though they're authorized by the crown of Spain, they're really just think of them as mercenaries, okay? They're superior warriors, they have superior technology, they have superior battle tactics, and so like they've got swords which beat what the natives have in Western Hemisphere. They have gunpowder, clearly that's superior. They have cannons, clearly superior. Horses didn't even exist in the Western Hemisphere. The Spanish also had attack dogs too, which I learned about because I actually wrote like a 25-page paper on the invasion of Mexico back in college by the Spanish. So you have, even though you have smaller numbers, you have superior technology, superior fighters, and there's other factors too. You have a hidden factor that they come with, which we'll leave to talk about in just a moment. So Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire, Cortez lands, we're going to do the short version here. Cortez lands in Veracruz. He's able to take advantage of the fact that the Aztecs basically have two seasons, the war season and the farming season. And basically what happens is he lands in the farming season. The Aztecs can't send the people that are farming out to go fight because then you don't have any food. So he takes advantage of that. The other things that he takes advantage of is the Aztecs have a really ineffective, at least in my opinion, a very ineffective way of ruling. So they have all these other city-states, all these other territories that they rule, but, and it doesn't say this in the textbook, this is something I learned from college, is basically the only thing that the Aztecs were concerned about in terms of who ruled those areas was, I mean, just pay us. That's all they want. So in some cases, the original rulers would go ahead and still be put in place just as long as you gave them their money. They didn't really care. So that obviously is going to create animosity. So what that allows for Cortez to do is to basically go and take all the disgruntled territories that the Aztecs rule and rally them to his side. The other thing that works out an advantage for Cortez too is that he is believed to be a representative of Quetzalcoatl, and that is someone who was an ancient god. There's more to it than that. It's not for the purpose of this class, but basically they think he's someone he's not, that he has these supernatural powers, or he's a representative of God. Some accounts even like he's supposed to be Quetzalcoatl himself. So Montezuma is like kind of like really afraid to insult Cortez. Right. So unfortunately for the Spanish, they essentially wear out their welcome. This is after a year. They hold Montezuma captive. They eventually kill him. They're being chased out of the city, and a lot of them end up dying. But what ends up happening is Cortez goes ahead and rallies some more of his allies from the surrounding regions, and they return to try and defeat the Aztecs. But the thing that they noticed is that the Spanish had actually brought a invisible gift with them when they came. And that's because one of the men that were with Cortez actually had traces of smallpox with him. And so the one thing you have to keep in mind is that smallpox is something that, well, first of all, is deadly anywhere it goes, but it's especially deadly to a group of people who have no resistance to it whatsoever. No one in the Western Hemisphere has ever experienced smallpox, so no one has any built up immunities with it, and it basically devastates the Aztec population, makes it easy for Cortez and his men to essentially conquer the Aztec people. So as far as other areas in South America, you have the Incas, who basically, it's almost the same thing. So it's not Cortez this time. There's a different Spaniard. His name is Pizarro. Pizarro arrives in South America shortly after the Incas had had their bout with smallpox. The smallpox ends up killing their emperor, who has two sons. Those two sons want to go ahead and fight each other for control of the empire. Basically, Pizarro goes ahead and waits until the fight is over, once there's a winner, then takes his men and all of his allies and wipes out the remainder of the Inca the Inca army. And so they basically control it from there. Okay, some last things here that we're going to focus on. My goodness, it is storming outside. So one of the things that we want to focus on is some things going on in the world in terms of economy. There are some problems with inflation that occurs with the new things that are coming over from the West. One of those things are going to be precious metals like silver. That's more prominent in Spain. So if you don't know what inflation is because you didn't take economics, or maybe you just don't know in general, inflation is when the price of goods and services goes up. So one of the other things that you might see this referenced in terms of a test or in terms of your textbook is referred to as the price revolution. Okay, so if you hear price revolution, this is just talking about the period of high inflation during European expansion. Okay, one of the things that we need to take note of is that wages do not increase for people. So you can see how that would play a role in how the lives of the individuals working back then. So if my wages don't change, but the prices of goods keep going up, we can tell that basically what happens is my quality of life is going to go down, because I can't buy the same amount of goods and services that I did with back then. Because like if I'm making, just for rough, say $1,000 a week in today's time, and the price of everything goes up, I can't buy as many things as I could last year because, well, I still have the same $1,000. Now, this is really impactful on the working class, but it's not so impactful on the wealthy, because they're the ones who own the land. So what they do in response to inflation is they just raise the rent on people. So once again, we have the working class people who are kind of getting the wrong end of the stick, because not only did your food increase, but your rents increased too. Did you have any increase in wages? No. So that's going to be another way in which the quality of life decreases. It doesn't just have a impact on the working class, it also impacts governments too. Because things become more expensive, you have two things that end up occurring with governments in terms of raising finances. They borrow money from the bank, which comes at a cost because there's interest rates with it. Then the other way in which they raise money is they go ahead and increase taxes. Who's going to pay the taxes? The exact same group we said who've been getting shafted the whole time. So now I have cases of where I have my food has increased the cost, I have my rents increased, and now I have taxes being slapped on me in addition to that. So this is a really bad time for people in terms of Europe, in terms of their quality of life. Now there are some different perspectives as to how that actually, like what caused the price revolution. As I said, silver, all the precious metals coming in, and we know if you took economics, basically what happens is the more people spend, the higher prices get. And so the other part that's mentioned is a possible cause is that you have an increase in population during this time too. And if you know anything about an increase in population, that means an increase in demand, and then an increase in demand results in an increase in price. Those are just basic economic concepts. So some other things to finish off with here. We are almost done. Is we need to talk a little bit about the growth of commercial capitalism. So basically the expansion of world trade, the expansion of trade would tie the world together in terms of trading partners. So the focus, as we said before, will basically be moving to the Atlantic seaboard, because that's kind of the point where, like, it's the center of it. So like you have North and South America off to the west, You have the countries of the nations of Asia off to the east, and they can all converge in this one point along the Atlantic seaboard, along Africa and Europe. So that's how we end up with triangular trade too. If you're not familiar with triangular trade, basically what would happen is you'd have manufactured goods go to Africa. They would sell those goods to Africa in exchange for slaves. Slaves would be sent to the Americas, and then basically what would happen is slaves were traded for raw materials, and those materials were sent over to Europe, and you just keep that cycle over and over again. But we'll be talking more about that actually in our next lecture. Oh, excuse me, I believe. Some other things that made commercial capitalism easier to do is you have the creation of joint stock companies. International trade, especially with what we're dealing with now, is extremely expensive. And so what ends up happening is you end up with a joint stock company. So what that means is basically individuals buy shares of a company to raise the money for these trading adventures. And then if it's successful, all the people who invested their money end up making dividends off of it, which are profit. And so that's an easy way to basically get something going quickly as far as trade goes. Other things that happen too is you have changes in the banking system. So for example, we just mentioned with joint stock companies, but people would borrow money, and local like family banks can't compete with all the demand for the money that needs to be borrowed. So we end up having the creation of the Bank of Amsterdam, and that essentially works as two functions. You can deposit your money, and you can actually trade stocks there too. Okay. Last one is we want to focus on mercantilism, and that's the actual economic policy of European nations at this time. So the whole goal of mercantilism is to have more, in terms of dollar value, exports than you do imports. They were very protectionist, okay? So what are some of the things, like goals other than that, like you say, have more exports than imports? There are some, like smaller goals that we can kind of throw underneath that. Things like we want to accumulate precious metals. We want protectionist policies. Colonies plays a big role in that too, because those open up markets for you to end up trading with. And so with protectionism, what would happen is like Spain would only allow the Spanish colonies to trade with Spain. And then if you're familiar with American history, England only allowed the colonies to trade with England. You could get around that, but England would jack the prices up through tariffs so high that it was basically pointless. Other things too that would happen is there was increased shipbuilding, which obviously would be for trade, encouraging manufacturing goods because you need to be able to sell things. So those are just some of the methods that are some of the goals and tools to do those things. The one thing that you want to basically understand is that they really discourage trade with other countries. And basically, it's like, hey, I could get it cheaper from this other country, but then that would mean that I'm not supporting my own people, my own economy, so I'm going to slap a giant tariff on that. Think of mercantilism as being very, very heavily influenced by state governments. That's going to wrap it up. I know that was a little bit long, but that's just how it is. All right, hopefully you got something valuable out of this one, and I will see you in the next video.